Professor Grzegorz Pac is now turning his point to the medieval calendars, so he'll be somehow also continuing the discussion that already started in the paper of Professor Kubin. So I could introduce him as a member of Institute of History at the Warsaw University, his fields of interest being hagiography, matrimonial images and legends, and women's history in Middle Ages also. So welcome, and the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. I have to say that listening to this discussion on the one side was Professor Kubin, on the other me, and Wojciech Jasiński and me, I had a feeling that now the defense of the early cult of St. Ludmila is coming from Poland, which is quite funny. Sorry, I don't have a presentation, but when our chair tells us that we have some extra time, I decided that I will show you some manuscripts, so I will sometimes share a screen with you. So, let me start. Calendars features large in the research on the cult of St. Ludmila and the discussion on its origin, as their reference to the saints have been the subject of numerous insightful studies. The present paper aims is to reconsider our information on the subject, as well as addressing a number of issues that raise scholarly doubts. I would like to stress that I'm going to focus in this paper, due to the limit of time, only on the early cult. In the written version, I probably try to extend that also to the later Middle Ages. In order, however, to address this issue, it is necessary to be clear about one's perspective on the central question, namely the beginning of the cult of St. Ludmila. I think it was clear what is my view, but let me coming back to that. So it is my view, expressed fully elsewhere, that it developed dates at early age, at the end of the 10th century, and while Prague's St. George Abbey, housing Saint's body, was its undoubted center, there is nothing to indicate that it failed to spill beyond its walls. Arguments for this early cult include the saint's portrayal in the earliest life of St. Wenceslaus, as well as her own life, Fuit in Provincia Bohemorum, dated fairly anonymously to the 10th century, convincing, according to me, arguments in favor of the 10th century date for the Legenda Christiana, and archaeological traces on the preservation of her remains. Among the sources for the cult in the 11th century, well beyond the walls of St. George, an important place is owed to a calendar that, due to erroneous determination of the date and place of its writing, has long failed to be used as an argument for Ludmila's cult before 12th century, which was in fact presented by Professor Kubin. And let me share with you, because this is very beautiful manuscript. Here you have an image.
Yes.
So the calendar is found in the pages added to the 10th century Egbert Psalter from Trier, when it came into the possession of Gertruda. She was a daughter, here you have Gertruda and her son and daughter-in-law. She was a daughter of the Polish king Mieszko II and wife of Prince Izyaslav of Kiev, who died in 1108. Around the mid-12th century, the codex, known also as Codex Gertrudianus, made its way to Zweifelden Abbey in Swabia, as can be seen from the obituary notes added to the calendars on the margin. I will show them later, or maybe I can show it right now. Here you have those marginally notes. Yes. Under the date of November 12, you have to believe me because it's very hard to read that. So here, November 12, the calendars feature the word Ludmila Virginis. There is no much doubt that the Ludmila in question is the grandmother of St. Wenceslaus. Even if her epithet is wrong, it should be Vidua, as is the date. It should be November 10. The latter error, as suggested by Józef Kalousek already, and accepted by later scholars, is a result of the mix-up with the festival of the Five Brothers, invariably noted under November 12, except here, where it features under November 10. Kalousek, who in 1902 introduced Czech medievalists to this source, was the first to place the calendar's writing in Prague after 1143. He reached this conclusion on the basis of the presence of the whole set of Bohemian saints. In addition to Ludmila and the five brothers, Polish martyrs with a particular lively cult in Bohemia, the calendar also includes 2 references to St. Wenceslaus, his Dies Natalis and translation. Furthermore, 2 days after the translation, again you have to believe me, it's here, after the commemoration of the latter, after his Dies Natalis, under September 13, it is written, Dedicatio Ecclesiae Sancti Wenceslai Martyris. This is the day, as we know from the monk of Sazava, that the Prague Cathedral was consecrated in 1143. There are, however, numerous arguments against the calendar's late date and against Bohemia as the most likely birthplace. As to the date, it seems implausible that the calendar written after 1143 would not include St. Gotthard, who was very popular in Central Europe following his canonization in 1131, and who is included in all calendars belonging to the group of the oldest Bohemian calendars made up to the early 13th century. I will come back to this group later. The assumption that the calendar was written after 1143 is also problematic on account of his presence at Zweifelten before or shortly after 1151, the date of the death of the last person noted in Swabia, in obituary notes added in Swabia. I think it's this person. It's Bertold of Andres. Bohemia was, as is well known, linked to Zweifelten thanks to wife of Vladislav I, Rycheza of Berg, whose family treated the abbey as its house cloister. But we hear nothing about their mutual contacts after her death in 1125. Although the Bohemian ducal couple was remembered in prayer at Zweifelten itself, as we know from the necrology written there, the absence of the duke from the discussed calendar, which mentioned only Rycheza, cast doubts on the idea that it arrived at Swabia from Bohemia. It is much more likely that it arrived from Poland, where Rycheza's sister Salome of Berg and her husband, Duke Bolesław Rajmów, maintained an intensive relationship with Zweifelten, continued by Salome until her death in 1144. They both merited commemorative notes in the Codex Gertrudianus. To return to the place of the calendar's birth, it is much more likely to have been written in Gertruda's lifetime, that is before 1108, at Kraków, or on the basis of the earliest calendar written there. The worship of not only the Polish martyr, the five brothers, but also St. Wenceslaus, the patron of the local cathedral, would be quite understandable at Kraków. It must have been that cathedral that is referred as the church of St. Wenceslaus consecrated on September 13. Well, we know nothing about any consecration of Krakow Cathedral on this day. It would not have been an arbitrary choice. Of course, churches could be consecrated in various days. There was, however, a testified custom, and I can show you a few examples for that if you want, of consecrating church on an octave or a day following the patron's feast. Since September 29 was taken up by the feast of St. Michael, September 13 was a probable date of the dedication of any church of St. Wenceslaus, in common with the Prague Cathedral, the only one for which we have the relevant information. The main argument for the calendar's link to Poland and its dating to the last quarter of the 11th or the eventual beginning of the 12th century is, however, the relationship to Gertruda that is shared with the Codex to which it was added. This is clear from the Byzantine miniatures I have shown you already, and Latin prayers in the pages added to the Egbert Psalter, which mention the names of the princess and her family members. As I have attempted to demonstrate elsewhere, the calendar itself was written to meet the personal requirements of the princess, and not without influence of the tradition prevalent in Rus. The calendar belongs also to obituary notes added before the Codex found itself at Zweifelten, written in a hand similar to that responsible for the calendar. You have seen one here. One of them, the one I am showing you right now, mentioned Demetrius' infants. It is this that I see the strongest argument for the calendar's writing in Gertruda's lifetime. The name of Demetrius, practically unknown in Poland or Bohemia, was the Christian name of Gertruda's husband, Izyaslav, and must have been passed down in the Kiev princess line. It must have been therefore someone closely linked to Gertruda, perhaps her old grandchild, deceased in infancy. Back to St. Ludmila. If my argument is right, then we have evidence that her translation was added to the calendar no later than in the last quarter of the 11th century or at the beginning of the 12th, albeit with a double error. All this points not only to an early cult, but also to its expansion into southern Poland, whose link with Bohemia, exemplified by St. Wenceslaus Cathedral at Krakow, make it, in fact, unsurprising. Now I would like to support Professor Kubin and just a short remark about another calendar, which is believed sometimes to be from the 11th century. It was only recently that David Kalthaus drew attention to another 11th century calendar from outside Bohemia that mentions St. Ludmila, namely to a note on the margin of the martyrology written at Magdeburg in the 11th century codex, which under September 16 lists Passio Sanctae Ludmilae, and under November 10 Translatio Sanctae Ludmilae Martyris. I can also show you that, I think. As I have a photo thanks to the courtesy of the Abbey's library. Abbey of Wyszbrod. Unfortunately, a detailed analysis leads us to reject this hypothesis. The editors unhappily dated to the 11th century several entires that clearly come from the later period, such as the reference to the 1132 Translatio Sancti Godehardti Episcopi under May 4, or to Cunegundis Imperatrice under 10 September. When we know that the cult of Emperor Cunegundis only emerged shortly before her canonization in 1201. Since the latter entry seems to have been written in the same hand as the Passio Sanctae Ludmilae, here you have a Passio Sanctae Ludmilae, and let me show you the entry about Cunegund. Oh, here it is. This is this one. So since they are written probably by the same hand, this is the opinion of the editors, it seems likely that St. Ludmila was added to this martyrology in the 13th century, and after the codex had made its way to southern Bohemia, to Wyszbrod, where St. Wenceslaus, St. Procopius, and the five brothers were all added. So, as I said, this is the point I can agree with Professor Kubin. This is here, obviously, David Kalthaus is wrong. If you have no 11th century calendar from Bohemia, there are as many as 7 from the 12th and early 13th century, as against none from Poland. They were written in abbeys of Brzewnow, Ostrów, Podlazice. In Prague, one link to the Cathedral chapter, known as the Martyrologium Pragense, and 2 from St. George Monastery, and finally the calendar from the Horologium Olomoucense of Bishop Henry Zdik. As noted by Duszan Trzeszcik, Ludmila is referenced in all of them except Martyrologium Pragense. It is worth paying attention to this omission. Franciszek Graus believed that in the current form found in the Wienense Codex 395, the Martyrologium Pragense, although itself written later, is faithful to the calendar's form in the 3rd quarter of the 11th century. The sole latter addition, according to Graus, was St. Gotthard, added under May 4, that is the day of his translation in 1132. As you can see, St. Gotthard is quite important in this story. Let us also note as another later addition the entry under October 11, Translatio Domini Nostri Sancti Augustini, rightly seen by Graus as influenced by canons regular. It was, according to him, mechanically copied into the martyrology from the earlier source. I should note, however, again, I can show you a microfilm of this. Sorry. Here we are. Here you have. Sorry, I wanted. To show you St. Gotthard. Oh, okay, sorry, I have some. Okay, St. Gotthard is here. Okay. Right. You have St. Gotthard here, and the obituary margin notes here. Okay, sorry. But coming back to the story of the the Translatio Domini Nostri Sancti Augustini. So Graus is right that it is probably influenced by canons regular. It was, according to him, mechanically copied into the martyrology from the earlier source. I should note, however, that this entry, whether in the Martyrologium Pragense or in some original calendar, could not have been written in the 11th century, since the earliest mention of St. Augustine in the context of canon life in the Reich dates to the 1090s. It is hard to imagine that it could have been any earlier than the 1120s or 1130s. Since we have two entries of a clear 12th century provenance, that is St. Gotthard and Sanctus Augustinus, called Dominus, the question is whether the whole can still be dated to the third quarter of the 11th century. And anyway, such speculation and dating of the non-existent calendar allegedly copied by our source seems dubious. It is probably more important to note that in its present form, the calendar must have been written after 1132, but before 1157, when, according to Graus, the necrology was no longer updated. It seems most likely that the calendar was written at the same time as the necrology, that is in the years 1151, 1157, or slightly earlier. I would like to show you that because it seems that the hands of the calendar, the hands of obituary notes are very similar, if it's not the same hand. If, however, the calendar could have the very popular St. Gotthard added at this time, why not Ludmila? Could it be a sign of the hostility of the bishops of Prague toward her cult, as postulated by some scholars on the basis of Cosmas and the appendix to the chronicle of so-called Canon of Visegrad? Firstly, as I have attempted to demonstrate elsewhere, a close analysis of either source fails to support the theory of the Prague's bishop resistance to the cult of St. Ludmila. What is more, both actually point to the devotion to the saint on the part of the members of the chapter, both Cosmas the dean and those members who advised and helped the nuns with the saint's relics in a year 1142. Secondly, the translation of St. Ludmila is not the only Bohemian commemoration of the saint to be omitted. Unlikely all the other Bohemian calendars of to the early 13th century, the Vienna Codex 395, fails to mention the five brothers. It also omits, surprisingly for the text emanating from the Prague Cathedral chapter, the translation of St. Adalbert from Gniezno to Prague, which is found in the calendars from Brzevnov, one of those from St. George Abbey, and in that from the Chronologia Olomoucense. As we know well from Cosmas, the memory of the five brothers and their martyrdom, as well as the translation of St. Adalbert, was vivid in Prague chapter in the first half of the 12th century, and the days commemorating those events were well known. It is not naturally the case that the author of the calendar, who was most likely connected to the Prague Cathedral chapter, failed to include any Bohemian commemoration. We have here the Dies Natalis of both St. Adalbert and St. Wenceslaus, the latter's octave and his translation on March 4. The cathedral's chief patrons are thus included, but generally speaking, the additions are sparse in this calendar. It is thus difficult to draw any far-reaching conclusions about the chronology of the cult of St. Ludmila or its prevalence in the Prague chapter from her omission in this calendar. To return to the earliest Bohemian calendars, to mention St. Ludmila, that is all the other ones written by the early years of the 13th century, they all mention the November Commemoration. Yet, the Saint Dies Natalis on September 16 is found in the main body of only the Brzevnov calendar, while in the other calendars it features, if at all, as an addition. In the Horologium Olomoucense, let me show you that again. In the Horologium Olomoucense, here you have September commemoration of Passio. The addition is made in a different hand, but considered contemporarily, while in the other cases, it was added much later, as late as the 16th or the 17th century. Let us add that the November commemoration is as a rule referred as Ludmila Martyris or something similar, with the occasional clarification that it concerns her translatio only added at a later date. This confirms the observation of Zdenek Fiala that November 10 was the original commemoration day of the Duchess saint, while the September celebration comes into existence at the later date. Once the celebration of the Dies Natalis became widespread, there was also a need to make it clear that November 10 marked the saint's translatio. It is worth adding that the chief commemoration of the saint on the day of their translatio is nothing surprising. It was a widespread practice right up to the 13th century. If the provenance of the September 16 Dies Natalis is relatively clear, the day of the saint's death is given by all her lives, including the oldest one. Then the date of translatio gives rise to serious doubts. The question of its origins and what exactly it commemorates remains open, as the day of November 10 fails to appear in any of St. Ludmila's lives. It is also absent from the Legenda Christiani and Fuit in Provincia Bohemorum, where we read of the transfer of her body by her grandson, St. Wenceslaus, from Tetin to St. George Church in Prague. In one of the Fuit manuscripts, the fragment is even entitled Translatio Sancta Ludmila. The narrative has the envoys find the saint's body at Tetin without any signs of corruption on October 19 and bring it to Prague 2 days later on October 21. The reinterment is then delayed thanks to the miraculous intervention of the saint, who does not wish to be buried in the unconsecrated church. The bishop must then be brought over from Regensburg to consecrate the church 6 days before her burial. The fragment ends in a miracle performer on the anniversary of the translation. Convinced that the transfer described should be seen as identical with translatio, understood as canonization, Joseph Cibulka proposed the following solution of this problem with dates. The body arrived at Prague on October 21, but the arrival of the Bishop of Regensburg took some time, resulting in November 10 as a day of the deposition of the body. The idea was accepted by Dusan Trzeszczyk, and it could indeed explain the date, so difficult on the face of it to reconcile with the above narrative. But it still fails to explain why neither Legenda Christiani nor Fuit in Provincia Bohemorum mentions this date, November 10, key as it is to the cult of the saint. That, however, is not the only issue. The description in the Legenda Christiani no doubt contains typical elements of the translation narrative. The miraculously preserved body, a saint deciding the details of her own burial, the presence of bishop. Here, however, we run into a fundamental problem. The description clearly talks of the interment in the ground, underlined by the bishop's injunction, backed up with a biblical quote, "Earth to earth and unto earth thou shalt go." Ludmila is buried in the place originally prepared for her, described as a trench, fossa. But thanks to the saint's miraculous intervention, the church where it is found had meanwhile been consecrated. The last point is explained as follows: cum benedictione maiori sepelieretur, facum sanctis ad Christi locanda erat dextram. For she was to be seated with the saints at the right hand of Christ. What may be surprising is, if it would be a canonization, of course, is the use of the participium futuri passivi. Ludmila is not yet among the saints on the right of the Lord, but is to arrive there. All that, and especially the form of the burial, suggests that we are not dealing with Ludmila's canonization, but merely her interment in the Przemyślid sepulchre. For as Eric Kemp is right to observe, in this period, quote, "It is certainly regarded as wrong for saints to be below ground," unquote. That is why we have elevatio. That means that the November 10 commemoration does not refer to the transfer of her body described in the Legenda Christiani and Fuit in Provincia Bohemorum, but to other event. It thus seems that Christian reference at the end of the fragment discussed here to the anniversary of the translation concerns this event and the already existing celebration. At the same time, he, I mean Christian, is guilty of manipulation of sorts. The fragment on the celebration of the day of translation is placed in such a way as to suggest that it concerned an anniversary of the event described earlier, that is, transfer of the saint's body from Tetin to Prague. The intention is probably to establish even closer links of not just the person of St. Ludmila, but also of the beginnings of her cult with the Legenda Christiani's maiden protagonist, St. Wenceslaus. As can be seen from the above, and I beg your forgiveness for the blindness of the conclusion, calendars, no doubt, continue an important source for the study of the early cult of St. Ludmila. At the same time, however, their use raises a number of issues, starting with the place and date of the writing of the calendars that do or do not mention Ludmila. At the same time, the calendars, starting with the 11th century specimen from the Codex Gertrudianus, provide the earliest evidence for the cult of St. Ludmila in the form of the feast of her translatio at November 10, on which we can only say that it commemorates the events that day of an unspecified year. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm also very grateful to interpreters for the interpretation to Czech. Thank you very much.
Professor Pac, thank you very much for your contribution to our conference. I believe we have plenty of time for discussion. I guess Petr Kubin would react, so I would ask him to pick a favorite microphone and language, but before he starts, maybe I will add some note, because this also struck my attention. As you described, that Legenda Christiani is not mentioning the translation time. Actually, if we look closer on the events that are described by Christians, there would be not enough time to make it till the 10th of November from the date that is mentioned in the hagiography, which is the 21st, I believe, of October, because there are two actually messengers sent to the bishopric of Regensburg, and then there is still 6 days of waiting period mentioned, so this definitely wouldn't fit in a 20 days between the 21st of October and the 10th of November. This is really interesting point, but I believe Professor Kubin...
but can I just answer to that? Yeah, I do agree. To be completely honest, I do agree, but because my main point is that it is not, this burial is not translatio. I just said something like, okay, Cibulka and then Trzeszczyk argues that it is possible. Maybe it is possible. I'm not going to, to count how much time you need to go to Regensburg coming back. This is hagiography. I don't think we should be so accurate. But even if they are right that it is possible, I don't believe it's translatio. That's my main argument.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe one last thing to add. I'm sorry, Professor Kubin. It is really interesting that even the Bishop Tuto in the story gives almost a really similar argument as Bishop Herman in the 12th century Cosmas Chronicle. He merely says that the body should be buried, that the body should rest in peace, actually. This is something that also struck my attention. Now, sorry, Professor Kubin, the floor is yours.
It's no problem. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I am also convinced with your opinion, with translatio. I am agree. I thank you also for support of my of the martyrology of Vyšší Brod from Magdeburg. But excuse me, I didn't understand well what did you say about the Codex Gertrudianus. Please, in 2 sentences, could you tell me when? So you don't, your opinion is it wasn't in Prague, or it was in Prague?
No, it wasn't in Prague.
It wasn't.
So shortly. Should I just my argument in a few sentences? Yes.
Please.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes. So the point I described that in length elsewhere. I can also send you this article. It was published in Roczniki Historyczne 3 years ago. But the point is there are a few problems with Prague after 1133. First, St. Gotthard should be there. Second, there is not enough time. I mean, there is some possibility, but if you accept that it was written in Prague after 1143, it means that it had to find its way to Tripalten in a few years. And then 1143, that's Kalousek argument, is based on the day of consecration of the Prague Cathedral. The point is that if you look to the tradition of the consecration of the church in medieval Europe, you can see that in fact there is some sort, as I said, you can consecrate a church in many days, but there is a sort of tradition, a sort of tendency to consecrate the church in the day following the feast of the saint or in the octave. So it means that this day, September 13, was a possible date of the consecration of the Krakow Cathedral as well, about which consecration we know almost nothing. And then the argument for calendar to be, the argument supporting the idea that the calendar was written in the times of Gertruda. First, it is in her codex, which has her prayers and so on. Then, as I try I haven't shown you details in this paper, but in this article I have just mentioned, I try to show that in the calendar itself is prepared for purpose of Gertruda. For example, it has 2 feasts of St. Demetrius, one Latin feast of St. Demetrius and one Greek or Russian one. And this is because of the rule of St. Demetrius in family of Iziaslav, her husband. It also has, for example, 21st May, Feast of St. Helena, so also according to the to the East tradition. And again, and the last point, this obituary note, which is obviously written before, it's not written in Swabia, in Tripalten, but at the time when the calendar was written. This obituary note, there are 2 obituary notes. One is Sul obit, which sometimes is some scholars relate that with the Sulla, who was a bishop of Prague, but we can't be sure about that. But this Demetrius infans obit, I can hardly imagine any Demetrius infans in Bohemia or Poland in those times. Nobody used this name as well as we know in those times in Bohemia, in generally speaking in Latin Christendom. At the same time, you have the tradition of using this name as a Christian name in the Russian family of Gertruda, namely it was the Christian name of her husband. So it seems that Iziaslav, that Demetrius infans, who is mentioned in the calendar, in the obituary notes, written in the time when the calendar was written, has to be from her family, family of Iziaslav. Sorry, that was probably not a few sentences, but more, but I wanted to be clear.
Thank you very much for explanation. Although I have to, there are serious arguments, of course, but I have to refresh about it. So I would like ask you to send me your article, and thank you for it.
I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward, really. And let me just mention, Professor Kubin, that we have an opportunity. Maybe you don't remember that to meet in Prague many years ago when I was a student, and I really remember your kindness from this time. So it's a pleasure to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have two more questions. So maybe would there be a little bit briefer, but still I think we have some time. Dr. Jashinsky.
I want to stress that in the Christians' manuscripts, when it's told about the translation of just burial of Ludmila, they mention about that she will be buried in the church, but they don't specify in which church. There is no name. They just simply, the sources, I just read more than 20 manuscripts of this fragment because we got so many fragments of this part of Christian, tells that she will be buried, but the church isn't specially appointed. This is only a short remark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is quite interesting because it means that maybe I was wrong saying that she was buried in the Church of St. George. Maybe she was moved. I mean, that could be the translation of St. Ludmila. She could be moved from this church she was buried at the very beginning to the Church of St. George at the later date.
Well,
thank you very much.
This could be an interesting point in order to continue with the next paper of Dr. Bravermanova, but still we have Professor Homza asking something.
So I would just have small, short comment to the speech of Professor Pac, namely in Codex Gertrudianus there are also Cyrillic inscriptions which are strongly connected to the family pictures of Gertruda's son, Yaroslav, Yaropolk, and his daughter-in-law, Kunigunda of Saxony, and this Saint Peter. And of course, this celebration of Ludmila, Virgina, it could come also from the surrounding of the Rurikids family, because we know that the name Ludmila was already popular in Kievan Rus, just because of the family relations of Rurikids and Přemyslids, and there can be also the explanation why we have there this Virgina, not Vidua. But this is just my comments. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. I would just say that there is a problem, of course, with the cult of St. Ludmila in Rus, and this is also related with the question posed yesterday by Professor Lubka, if it was possible that Olga, or in the times of Olga, that the life of St. Ludmila was already known in Rus. The problem is, of course, that in the earliest version of Prologue, of this collection of hagiographical texts from the mid-12th century, Ludmila is not present yet, and she appeared there only later. And I think that another argument against, I think it was already Fiala noted that, I mean, I believe that it was my idea, but then I find that Fiala already mentioned that in fact Ludmila in Prologue is under her feast on September 16. As I try to argue that this is the later feast of St. Ludmila. So it seems that the cult of St. Ludmila had to appear, maybe not had to, but probably appear in Rus later, when the feast of September 16 was already popular, so probably after mid-12th century. But thank you very much.